dealing with security, how we're going to deal with when we receive these patients, how to manage risks and decide what was acceptable risk, as was alluded to earlier, and then address immediate threats. And I'll speak to that in a little more detail later. Communications, I think we've talked about. Communications is extremely important, and media. Whenever you have a big event, you're going to have media, and we'll talk more about the challenges that poses for us. We also do international travel tracking. We have students, we have faculty that travel across the world, and part of what our office does is tracks the whereabouts of those students, so if there's a need to repatriate them, we have international SOS with one of their clients, and we use them to help accomplish that. And then lastly, because we are a large university, we have students and faculty that come to us from countries around the world, and we needed to make sure that we had an appropriate screening process to take care of students who are coming to us from affected areas, and also to make sure that we are able to provide them support if they so need it. So going back to the security piece, in this instance, operational security was difficult. It was difficult because there were a lot of people who knew what was going to happen here. There was a lot of media presence. The aircraft photo that you showed earlier, that little tail number on that plane is registered, and every time that flight plan is registered, the media is aware of it. So if that plane is flying to West Africa, they know about it and they start asking questions. And then we also had to start speaking to our staff and to people on campus. And when you start to tell the story, you obviously lose your ability to maintain operational security. We had to consider motorcade security as we brought that patient from the airport to our hospital and what that was going to look like. Initially, we wanted to keep that a very low-key operation. It morphed into a kind of high-profile operation with a very large motorcade, especially with patients 2 and 3. We were worried about perimeter security around the hospital and within the campus. We have a very large hospital that sits in the middle of our college campus, so that poses kind of different threats and different opportunities for us. We had to worry about hospital security in terms of beyond the normal ops that are taking place in there, of how do we secure that special unit and make sure that we're only letting the people that need to be in there in, and if there's any issues that we're able to contain it. And then unfortunately, we did get some threats when it became public that we were going to receive this first patient. There were some people who were not particularly happy about that. And thankfully, the threats that we received ended up not panning out to be real. But because we did receive some traffic and feedback, it made us take it to the next level to ensure that we had appropriate security and that we were vetting those risks and making sure that this wasn't going to be more than what we needed to know about. And lastly, there was an outpouring of support. People wanted to give packages to the patients. They wanted to send cards. And the decision we made early on is we're not going to take packages and we're not going to take cards. We appreciate it. We'll figure out how that organization that those patients work for can set up a website and you can send your condolences and your thoughts and wishes electronically, but we didn't want the risk of accepting materials and having to put in another operational process of that screening country. This is an example of one of the EOD dogs. So when we started to clear the area, we had to secure a perimeter, we had to sweep the perimeter and keep it sterile until we got the patients in. With the third patient, we didn't go to that extent because we didn't have any threats. With the first 2, until we got those threats resolved, this was the action we took. There was a great deal of security around the perimeter with our police department, aided by the local police department, DeKalb County. We also had FBI SWAT in the motorcade, and subsequently later, we had DeKalb County Police SWAT in the motorcades as they were coming from the airport. Switching communications. This is a big deal. We all talk about it. We talk about it in emergency management. It's talked about in all of our fields. We had to be very, very deliberate about internal messaging. When we first started announcing to staff that we were going to bring this patient into the hospital, we wanted to make sure that they understood why we chose to do this, why it was the right thing to do, and give them an opportunity to ask us questions and let us hear their concerns. And the staff ended up being very supportive. In fact, some of the staff that work in that containment unit actually canceled their vacation time and came back into work specifically so that they could care for the patients. Along those lines, we also had to do external messaging. And I am still very deliberate, as we are deliberate, in terms of HIPAA compliance, even though the entire world knows the names of these patients. We still refer to them as patient 1, patient 2, and patient 3, because we're not going to release that information. And that was the kind of deliberate messaging we needed to do. We also have many moving parts in our organization, and there are many moving pieces in terms of the processes of repatriating these patients. The State Department has been mentioned, federal agencies, the CDC, our healthcare organization, our university organization. All these moving pieces all have a story to tell. And like all crisis communications, we needed to make sure that that message was consistent, that it was variable only where it made sense to tell the story of that particular organization, but the overall message that was being given by all was consistent and concise. We had a vehicle management issue. At one point, and I'll show you a picture of it next, I had 32 vehicles on the sidewalk out in front of the hospital and on the campus, many of them being satellite vehicles, and trying to manage that traffic, make sure that we kept traffic moving on the roadways, that it was safe in the area, became a challenge. And then press conference coordination became a challenge. As you can imagine, and we're still receiving them, we had voluminous requests to get press conferences and have subject matter experts speak with media. And we had to make sure we had a very ironclad process to ensure that we had the right people speaking, that we were able to coordinate that appropriately, but also meet the needs of the media. And we actually had a good relationship with them once they understood that we wanted to give them what they needed, but that we had to follow some ground rules. That actually worked out very well. So that's an example of what we had kind of lined up along the sidewalk for quite some time. It became quite an encampment for several days. During every press conference, we made sure we had the appropriate backdrop. You can't see it in this slide because I don't have a picture of it, but in this kind of a room approximately this size, this auditorium, the entire back of the auditorium was covered with media personnel, cameras, etc., as we were doing these press conferences. And that became another challenge in terms of vetting them, getting them in, and getting them into place. Every time there was a news sequence at the time of day, we had someone out there, and we often had someone wanting to speak to some of our staff so that this could be done. And that was kind of the biggest piece with the media, was making sure we gave them what they needed, we had a consistent story, that we managed those vehicles, and we were able to give the story that we wanted to give, but also control information that we didn't want to get out to protect those patients' privacy. And then the last piece is, because we have international students, we have to be able to track and repatriate them if they get into trouble. As I mentioned earlier, we do use international SOS. They've been very good to use. We've been pleased with what they've done. We've actually used them to bring students back out of Haiti during the earthquake. But we found, and I think many companies have encountered this as well, for the undergraduate students and faculty that we're sponsoring, we have very tight controls. If you want us to pay for your travel, you will register with this company, and your travel will be managed in that way. But we also have graduate students and faculty who are funded in different means, and we're not paying for it, and there's a different travel agency involved that's arranging travel for them. And those folks don't always register in ISOS like we want them to. So to address that, we've developed a parallel process with school contacts that we're able to reach out to help us track where we have students, faculty, and staff. During this process, we identified 4 students who were either currently or had recently been in the countries in West Africa that were affected. We had found that they had all come back safe or had plans to come back. And we set up a very specific screening process for them. We also identified one PhD candidate who was going to travel to Liberia to do their thesis. And we had a long conversation. We were able to convince him that it would probably be best if he postponed those plans and made different arrangements. And that's not always easy to do. Folks working on their thesis don't want to hear that. They want to go get that done. It's been a lot of work and that's the timeline. But we were able to convince him it was best for him to stay. And as part of the screening process, we were very deliberate in setting up what to do for those students. We sent them guidance from the CDC as to what steps they should be taking in terms of their own health. We also scheduled them to have a face-to-face screening exam in our student health services section so that we could make sure that they weren't ill, we understood what to look for, and then we could set up a process to check in with them on a daily basis until the 21 days had been met and we knew that they were okay. We also added, we'd already been screening for MERS, but we added a process for screening for patients that presented who had been traveling in the affected countries in West Africa. And once you ask those questions, have you been traveling out of the country in the last 30 days? And you start going through the processes, it's a way to help identify, do I have somebody who's potentially at risk? And now, more importantly, are they ill? And to what degree are they ill? And that helps advise us on what steps we need to take in terms of additional care that's required. And then lastly, we knew we had students coming from those countries who might be personally affected, either with someone in their family who is ill or someone they knew. So we wanted to make sure we had appropriate counseling services in place. So if they needed support, we could provide them with that support. We also worried about any kind of stigma where people realized they had come from those countries, that they might not be treated in the most appropriate way. And the emotional fallout of being mistreated that way, we would make sure that we had a counseling process in place to address that. So that's the end of my presentation. I'll turn it back to Don to...
Sam, that was very well spoken, and I think the fact that patient number 1, number 2, and number 3 had such a good outcome is a testament to your